Every deadliest samurai weapon explained. Close your eyes for a second. Imagine a battlefield. No gunshots, no explosions, just the sound of boots on wet earth and the whisper of steel cutting through air. Before you hear anything, someone is already dead. The samurai didn't just fight. They perfected killing into an art form. Every weapon they carried told a story of honor, of blood, of a death so precise it bordered on beautiful. Today, we go inside those weapons, and I promise you by the end of this, you'll never look at a blade the same way again. For over 700 years, the samurai ruled Japan not just with power, but with principle. They lived by Bushido, the way of the warrior, a code that said, your honor is more important than your life. And that one idea, honor above life, shaped every weapon they carried, every technique they mastered, every death they delivered. These weren't soldiers. They were walking philosophies, armed ones. And here's something most people get wrong before we even start. The samurai wasn't primarily a swordsman. He was, first and foremost, an archer. The bow came before the blade. Range before reach, silence before steel. Keep that in mind as we go through each weapon, because the order matters. Let's meet their arsenal. Weapon 1. The katana. Every warrior culture in history has had a sword. The Romans had the gladius. The Vikings had the long sword. But no blade in human history has ever carried the meaning of the katana. The katana wasn't just a weapon. Under Bushido, it was considered the literal soul of the samurai. When a warrior died, his katana was placed beside him because without it, his spirit had no home. Now let's talk about what it actually did. The katana is a curved, single-edged blade usually between 60 and 80 centimeters long. That curve isn't decorative, it's engineering. A curved blade concentrates force into a smaller surface area at the moment of impact, making each strike hit harder, cut deeper, and travel faster through flesh. It was forged using a process called tamahagane folding steel on itself, again and again, producing thousands of microscopic layers that gave the blade two contradictory properties at once. Hard enough to hold a razor edge, flexible enough not to shatter on impact. A master swordsmith would work for weeks, sometimes months, on a single blade. The result wasn't just a weapon, it was metallurgical genius wrapped in silk cord. Now here's what the legends get wrong, and what the truth gets right. The katana was not the samurai's primary battlefield weapon. That was the bow, then the spear. The katana was closer to what a pistol is to a modern soldier, a sidearm. The weapon you reach for when everything else has failed, when the enemy is close enough to breathe on you, when there's no more room for arrows or spears. And that's what made it terrifying, because when a samurai drew his katana, it meant the situation had already gone beyond strategy. Samurai trained for years to deliver a killing blow in a single motion, drawing and cutting in one fluid, silent movement, a technique called iaijutsu. Here's the dark part. There is documented history of samurai testing a newly made katana on condemned criminals or, in some cases, on corpses to see if the blade could cut through bone cleanly in one stroke. They even had a ranking system for it. A blade-rated sando could cut through 3 bodies stacked on top of each other. Not a weapon, a work of lethal art. The katana didn't just end lives, it defined them. Weapon 2, the wakizashi. Every samurai carried 2 swords. You know the katana. But the second blade, the shorter one, that's where things get dark. The wakizashi, a blade between 30 and 60 centimeters. Shorter, lighter, easier to draw in tight spaces. In close combat inside buildings, narrow corridors. When the katana was too long to swing, the wakizashi became the weapon of choice. Fast, controlled, and absolutely lethal at close range. But here's what makes the wakizashi unlike any other weapon in history. It had a second purpose, one that had nothing to do with the enemy. When a samurai had been dishonored, defeated in battle, betrayed his lord, broken his code, there was only one path to redemption. Seppuku, ritual suicide, self-disembowelment with the wakizashi. The warrior would kneel, compose his death poem, then drive the blade into his own abdomen left to right, while a second samurai stood ready to deliver a final sword strike to end the suffering quickly. It was not considered tragedy, it was considered honor. The Wakizashi was the only weapon a samurai could turn on himself without shame. In a world where death was inevitable, the Wakizashi gave you the right to choose it. Weapon 3. The Naginata. Picture a long wooden pole nearly 2 meters capped at one end with a curved, sword-like blade. The Naginata. On the surface, it looks simple, a spear with a blade. But in motion, it becomes something terrifying. The Naginata could slash, stab, sweep low at legs, and knock warriors off horses. It created a deadly zone around its user. Anyone who stepped inside that radius was already too close. It controlled space, and on a crowded battlefield, controlling space meant controlling survival. Here's where history surprises you. While male samurai dominated the battlefield with the katana and spear, the naginata became the signature weapon of the Onabugeisha female warriors. Japanese noblewomen were trained extensively in naginata combat, not just for self-defense, but for war. There are records of women holding castle gates against invading armies, alone, with a naginata. One of the most famous Tomoe Gozen was described by ancient chronicles as a warrior worth 1,000. She rode into battle alongside male generals, and her enemies knew her name before they saw her face. The naginata outlasted every battlefield trend. Even today, it is still practiced in Japan and still taught primarily to women. Underestimated for centuries, deadly for all of them. Weapon 4. The kanabo. Forget elegance. The kanabo was a heavy iron or wooden club, sometimes spiked, sometimes ridged, designed for one single brutal purpose: to destroy armor. The katana, as beautiful as it was, had a weakness. Heavy plate armor could deflect or slow a blade, so the samurai developed a counter. You don't cut through armor. You crush it, and the person inside it. A single kanabo strike to a helmeted head didn't just wound its shattered bone through the metal. Ribs caved under its weight, joints dislocated. Soldiers struck by the kanabo didn't fall cleanly, they crumpled. The kanabo wasn't reserved for the biggest fighters on the field. It was a practical, tactical solution deployed by any samurai who needed to bring down a mounted, armored enemy. Against cavalry especially, a blade was nearly useless. You couldn't cut through a horse's momentum or a rider's layered armor. But you could interrupt both with a single crushing blow to the animal's legs or the rider's helmet. In Japanese folklore, the kanabo was the weapon of oni demons, not samurai. And maybe that tells you everything. The kanabo didn't just break bones. It broke the idea that armor could save you. Weapon 5. The yumi. Remember what we said at the start? The samurai was, first, an archer. Before the swords clashed, before the blood hit the ground. Before anyone knew the battle had begun, the yumi had already decided who would live. The Japanese longbow, asymmetric, elegant, nearly 2 meters tall, wasn't just a ranged weapon, it was the battle. In feudal Japan, wars often opened with extended archery exchanges that could last hours. Samurai on horseback practicing yabusame, mounted archery, would ride at full speed and release arrows at targets with terrifying accuracy. The yumi wasn't a support weapon. It was the opening act, the main event, and the closing statement all in one. The yumi could drive an arrow through light armor at 50 meters. At full draw, the release was nearly silent compared to the chaos of battle, meaning soldiers often didn't know they'd been targeted until the impact. The practice of archery kyudo was considered one of the highest samurai arts, not just for accuracy, but for the meditative focus it demanded. To release an arrow perfectly, the mind had to be completely still. Stillness. In the middle of war, the yumi killed from distances where its victims couldn't even see their killer. The sword ended a life. The bow ended a battle. We've talked about blades that cut, poles that sweep, clubs that crush, arrows that fly. But the most terrifying weapon the samurai ever carried wasn't what you think. Weapon 6. The kusarigama. A sickle attached to a long chain with a weighted iron ball at the end. That's it. Sounds simple, right? Here's what it did in combat. The chain could be swung at blinding speed, wrapping around an enemy's sword arm, their legs, their throat. Once entangled, the target was immobilized. Then the sickle came in for the kill. But it wasn't the mechanics that made the kusarigama terrifying. It was the sound. The chain spinning through air made a distinctive rhythmic whistle, low and rising in pitch as it accelerated. Experienced warriors knew that sound, and they feared it. Because unlike a sword you could see or an arrow, you could anticipate the chain moved in unpredictable arcs. It changed direction. It reached around shields. It was a weapon built not just to kill, but to disorient. To break the mental composure of an opponent trained in rigid, structured combat styles, samurai trained for years against swords, against spears, against bows. No one trained against a spinning chain and a curved blade coming from 3 different angles at once. The kusarigama didn't win through strength. It won through chaos. And in a world built on order and discipline, chaos was the deadliest weapon of all. 6 weapons. 6 different ways to end a life. But here's what history keeps trying to tell us, and what we keep almost missing. The samurai didn't worship violence. They feared it enough to master it. They carried blades not because death was cheap, but because they understood it was inevitable. The Bushido Code didn't teach warriors to seek battle. It taught them to be so prepared for it that they could face it without flinching. Every weapon in this video was designed with one philosophy underneath it. Die with honor, or don't die at all. And maybe that's why, centuries after the last samurai walked the earth, we're still here, talking about them, still making films about them, still studying their blades. Because in a world that often feels chaotic and purposeless, there's something hypnotic about people who knew exactly who they were, what they believed, and what they were willing to die for. The weapons rusted, the armor crumbled, the castles fell. But the code? The code doesn't rust. If you made it this far, you already know more about the samurai than most people ever will. Drop a comment. Which weapon did you find most terrifying? And if you want more dark history like this, subscribe. We're just getting started.